The Great Game has no rules, no treaties, no ceasefires, no negotiated boundaries between entities who embody the very concept of betrayal. In the Immaterium, that dimension of raw psychic energy running parallel to real space, four vast consciousnesses have been tearing at each other since before humanity learned to write down its fears. Khorne, oldest of the four, seated on his skull throne in the heart of the Brass Citadel. Tzeentch, scheming through the infinite corridors of his Crystal Labyrinth. Nurgle, patient and boundlessly content in his rotting garden. Slaanesh, youngest and most voracious, born from the deaths of an entire civilization. The question isn't whether the Great Game is eternal. The question is what happens the day it isn't. If one chaos god were to completely destroy the others and seize total dominion over the Immaterium, the consequence isn't a victorious god on an eternal throne. The mechanics of how these entities actually function, fed by mortal fear, rage, despair, and desire, mean that absolute victory requires consuming everything that sustains them. The Great Game isn't an eternal war, it's an eternal trap. Every scenario where one god wins ends in the same place, nowhere. But the trap only works if you understand how it was built. The Chaos Gods aren't gods in the traditional sense of beings who exist independently of worship. Each is a psychic entity formed from, and continuously fed by, the emotional output of sentient life across the galaxy. Canon is explicit. A Chaos God can only grow in power through the actions and thoughts of mortals. Khorne swells with every act of violence and bloodshed. Tzeentch draws sustenance from ambition, hope, and the desire for change. Nurgle feeds on the living's fear of inevitable death and disease, the specific terror of knowing that decay is coming and nothing can stop it. Slaanesh consumes excess in all its forms: pleasure, pain, obsession, any sensation pushed to its furthest extreme. This is the foundational dependency. The gods need the mortal galaxy to produce the emotions that sustain them, the same way a fire needs wood. Total victory. Consuming all other gods, eliminating all competition, becoming the sole ruler of the Immaterium, doesn't remove this dependency. It intensifies it. There is no triumphant endpoint where the winning god sits in power, drawing strength from a conquered cosmos. There is only the moment after the last enemy falls, and the silence that follows. The Great Game commands almost the complete attention of all four gods at all times. Only a fraction of their focus is ever fixed on the mortal realm. The gods are too busy fighting each other to consistently attend to the civilizations that sustain them. Each god funnels the vast majority of its power into the Immaterium conflict because dominance over the warp translates directly into dominance over the mortal emotions that fuel the next round of dominance. The cycle is self-reinforcing by design. The check and balance mechanism is its key structural feature. Whenever one god gains too much power, fed by its own success and drawing strength from its rivals, the other three form a temporary coalition to pull it back. One god rises, dominates, grows too powerful, and then the remaining three reduce it. Then another rises. Canon frames this as a pattern played out again and again through eternity. Dominance triggers coalition. Coalition restores balance. Balance dissolves back into competition. The wheel turns without stopping. Archival lore records at least one episode where Tzeentch once grew powerful enough that the other gods were forced to unite against him. And even that ended not in elimination, but in fragmentation and eventual recovery, with the blue scribes still tasked today with recollecting pieces of him scattered across the warp. The lesson the Great Game teaches isn't that the coalition works perfectly. It's that the coalition works well enough. No god has crossed the threshold. Every time one approaches it, the architecture of the game pulls them back. What follows, then, are the scenarios that ask what happens if someone breaks the architecture entirely. Khorne is the oldest of the Chaos Gods, the first to fully awaken in the warp. His domain is war, bloodshed, martial violence, and the rage that drives mortal beings to kill each other. Canon is unambiguous on this. Khorne cares not from where the blood flows, only that it flows. Every battle fought across the 10,000 worlds of the Imperium, Every skirmish on the Tau frontier, every raid and counter-raid and retributive massacre feeds him simultaneously. He doesn't care who wins. He doesn't care who started it. He cares that the killing continues. In a scenario where Khorne defeats and absorbs his three counterparts, the initial consequences are immediate and enormous. Tzeentch is the master of the warp's psychic medium, the god through whose nature the Immaterium's capacity for sorcery flows. Without him, the psychic architecture sustaining psyker ability across the galaxy begins to destabilize. The navigator houses that guide Imperial vessels through the warp using hereditary psychic sight would be operating in a fundamentally different environment. The currents and structures they navigate by shaped by divine domains that no longer exist. Khorne welcomes this. His hatred of manipulative sorcery is foundational to his character. He sees it as cowardly, a way of defeating enemies without the honest exchange of blood. Every psyker who burns out without a Tzeentchian structure to channel their power is, to Khorne, no great loss. Nurgle's absorption removes entropy's slower processes, decay, disease, the grinding inevitability of biological death by natural causes. What remains is violent death. Slaanesh's elimination strips sensation, pleasure, and obsession from the warp entirely. What's left is pure martial fury concentrated into a single will. The Brass Citadel, already a vast fortified environment of unending warfare, where Khorne sits on his skull throne surrounded by eternities of combat, expands across the entirety of the psychic dimension. Every corner of the warp becomes a battlefield. The Crystal Labyrinth stops shifting. The garden stops blooming. The palace of pleasure goes dark. There is only the endless red. Picture what this means for the mortal galaxy. Every world that had sustained trade, culture, political negotiation, the complex infrastructure that keeps billions of people alive in close proximity, faces a single demand from the now dominant psychic current flowing through every sensitive mind. Fight. Khorne's absolute dominion doesn't require an invasion force to impose this. The Immaterium bleeds into real space through every psyker, every dreamer, every person who has ever felt rage. Under a warp that is nothing but pure martial fury, the drift toward conflict becomes overwhelming. Populations that once argued descend into street violence. Soldiers who once followed orders follow only bloodlust. Commanders who once planned campaigns abandon strategy for slaughter. And here is the philosophical endpoint that makes the Khorne scenario uniquely self-defeating. Khorne draws his power from bloodshed. Bloodshed requires combatants. Follow the logic to its terminus. The wars grow total. Populations collapse. The last armies fight the last battles. The last survivor puts the last skull on the pile. Silence. No diplomacy, because there is no Tzeentch's scheming to sustain political order. No medicine, because Nurgle is gone and the slow biological processes of healing are stripped away. No beauty, no art, no pleasure in rest, because Slaanesh is gone. No new generations, because the drives that produce them have been burnt out by pure martial fury. The blood god sits on his skull throne in the Immaterium and waits for the next war. It doesn't come. There is no one left. The most direct path to total victory in the great game produces the most immediate self-destruction. Khorne wouldn't be conquered by an enemy. He would be starved by his own completeness, by the silence that settles over a galaxy that gave everything it had and has nothing left to give. Tzeentch presents a different problem, one that cuts at a deeper philosophical level than raw military power. In the Great Game, Tzeentch operates through proxies, schemes, and informational manipulation. He maneuvered Skarbrand, at the time the mightiest of Khorne's bloodthirsters, into attacking Khorne directly. Skarbrand hit with all his strength and put only a chink in Khorne's armor. Khorne grabbed Skarbrand and threw him so hard that he sailed through the sky for days before crashing into the ground so violently that his wings broke and never healed. Tzeentch didn't fight that battle. He arranged it from a comfortable distance, using Khorne's own greatest weapon against him. The Crystal Labyrinth, an endless, sprawling maze at the heart of his warp domain. Every path leading deeper into his control, every corridor shifting behind the walker, physically embodies how Tzeentch engages with existence, layer upon layer of misdirection, with the impossible fortress at the center hidden from everyone, including those already inside the maze. His power source is ambition, hope, and the desire for change. As long as mortals want tomorrow to be different from today, as long as they scheme and plan and reach for something beyond their current condition, Tzeentch grows stronger. Every hopeful prayer, every political conspiracy, every student studying for a better life than their parents had, all of it feeds the changer of ways. Canon is explicit on a point about Tzeentch that has no parallel for the other three gods. He has no grand plan, no ultimate goal to fulfill. For Tzeentch, the mere act of plotting and entwining the brief fates of mortals is purpose enough. The process is the point. The schemes aren't a means to an end. They are the end. A plan satisfied, tied up, finished, is a plan that has left his domain. There is no victory, no defeat, no final move. Ends are stagnation, the opposite of everything he represents. There will only be the endless clatter of dice in the mad games the gods play with the souls of mortals, rolled without end. Think about what winning would actually feel like for a being whose fundamental nature is change. Tzeentch has consumed Khorne. No more martial rage churning through the Immaterium, no more wars to manipulate, no more champions to corrupt across the front lines. He has consumed Nurgle. No more plague cycles to accelerate or retard, no more slow decay to weave plans around, no more followers of the Plague Lord to turn against their master. He has consumed Slaanesh. No more excess, no more obsessive desire, no more cults he can redirect toward his own ends. The galaxy is his. Every mortal who was ambitious is now ambitious in precisely the direction Tzeentch determines. Every plan is his plan. Every change is a change he has already designed. The Crystal Labyrinth expands across all of the Immaterium, an infinite maze with only one architect, one mind, one will directing every shifting corridor. This is the problem. A universe where all change is controlled is a universe where nothing actually changes. Tzeentch has produced the one thing he structurally can't tolerate, a finished state. The great game is over, done, complete. There are no rival plots to counter-scheme against. There are no mortals pursuing genuinely independent ambitions in a cosmos where all outcomes feed into his singular design. He has transformed the universe from an infinite source of chaotic change into a single, perfectly ordered machine, the one outcome most contrary to everything he is. The lore doesn't frame this as an explicit formal paradox in a single passage, but what it confirms is consistent. Tzeentch is change. He has no ultimate goal because completing a goal produces stasis. Stasis is, by definition, his absence. The god of change achieving permanence isn't ironic. It's definitionally impossible. The desire to win may be the one desire Tzeentch structurally can't form. What does Tzeentch want from the great game? The game continuing. Every machination that tilts the balance, then overturns it, then tilts it again. Every mortal scheme that fails and spawns two new schemes from its wreckage. This is the state most favorable to the changer of ways. The great game running forever, with outcomes constantly shifting, and the other gods constantly pushing back, and mortals constantly striving in ways he can redirect but never fully control. Not because he planned the great game to be endless, because he is the great game. The endless clatter of the dice is the only music there is. Nurgle's victory looks nothing like the previous two. It arrives not through overwhelming force or incomprehensible scheming, but slowly, warmly, and completely, like a tide that has no particular hurry because it knows the shore. The Plague Lord's power source is the mortal fear of inevitable death and disease, and the despair that floods in when mortals truly confront the reality that decay can't be stopped. Other gods need specific conditions: wars to break out, ambitions to form, sensations to be pursued to extremity. Nurgle needs only one thing: that something lives and knows it won't always. Disease, entropy, biological death, universal constants. Every civilization that ever existed across 10,000 years of galactic history has fed him. He has never had a bad century. His domain, the Garden of Nurgle, is described in the lore not as a wasteland, but as a teeming, self-sustaining ecosystem of filth, rot, and regeneration. It produces new life through its decay. Maggots become flies, rot becomes soil, death becomes the medium for more life in a different form. Even now, the garden physically blooms and encroaches on the domains of the other gods, its borders creeping outward whenever Nurgle's power waxes. Brought to completion, this expansion covers everything. Every corner of the warp becomes a version of the garden, disease and regeneration cycling without end, decay birthing new growth, birthing new decay in perpetuity. The goddess Isha makes this dynamic vivid in miniature. The Eldari deity of life and healing, seized by Slaanesh at the moment of the fall, then taken from Slaanesh's grasp by Nurgle in a subsequent war, sits now in a cage in the garden beside Nurgle's plague cauldron, in a corner of the room where grandfather tends his experiments. She can cure herself of any disease he creates. He feeds her his latest contagions directly and watches, with great attentiveness, to observe how long it takes her to overcome the effects. When he is pleased with a plague's endurance, he releases it into real space. When he isn't, he returns to the cauldron to refine his work. While he labors over the cauldron's contents, Isha uses his distraction to whisper cures to mortal populations. Instructions carried on the warp's currents to anyone sensitive enough to receive them. This is why, across human history, the worst plagues have sometimes broken unexpectedly, with no apparent cause. The goddess in the cage, buying time. In a Nurgle victory scenario, no one rescues Isha. There is no rival god whose domain provides a counter-narrative to the garden's slow spread. No Tzeentch with his ambition for change to resist entropy's advance. No Slaanesh with excessive sensation to counterpoint decay's quieter pleasures. No Khorne with his insistence on violent, immediate endings to contrast Nurgle's patient, prolonged ones. The whispered cures reach fewer and fewer mortals, not because Isha stops trying, but because the populations she speaks to are already halfway into the garden themselves. Here is the horror of the Nurgle scenario. Fear of death sustains him, but Nurgle's specific gift to his most devoted followers, what separates him from the other gods' relationships with their servants, is relief from that fear. The despair, at sufficient intensity, becomes acceptance. The acceptance becomes a kind of grotesque contentment. His followers don't suffer the way they once did. They are, by their own account, at peace. This is the psychological mechanism at the heart of his apocalypse. The process of consuming mortal fear produces, eventually, mortals who are no longer afraid. A galaxy saturated with Nurgle's dominance, every world blooming with the garden's slow expansion, every remaining mortal generation born into a culture of acceptance and decay, would eventually stop being afraid of death. Not because death becomes less certain, because it becomes so completely certain, so visibly everywhere, that the fear of it dissolves into familiarity. And when the fear is gone, when the despair has been fully metabolized into compliance, Nurgle's primary food source goes with it, the gentlest apocalypse in the great game. It doesn't arrive with screaming or battle or the crack of a birth scream tearing the sky. It arrives when the last being in the galaxy stops being afraid. The first three scenarios are hypotheticals. The Slaanesh scenario is built on an event that already happened. Approximately 10,000 years ago, dated to around M30, the ancient Eldari civilization, the most psychically advanced species in the galaxy at its height, spanning millions of years of dominance, collapsed under the weight of its own excess. The deterioration was gradual and then catastrophic. Over millennia, As the Eldari Empire reached its apex, its aristocracy, and then its general population descended into hedonism and excess on a civilization-spanning scale. Pleasure cults swept through their gleaming cities. Depravity replaced artistry, then consumed it. What had once been genuine aesthetic exploration became an insatiable hunger for sensation. Any sensation, more sensation, sensation taken to its furthest possible extremity, regardless of the cost. Every act of excess fed a growing vortex in the warp. Every Eldari born in those final millennia contributed psychic resonance to a pressure system that had been building for thousands of years. The mortal populations that would have served as psychic ballast were already corrupted, already part of the vortex. There was no outside pressure to stop it. The warp event astronomers later called the Fall wasn't a sudden disaster. It was the inevitable endpoint of a process that had been running for millennia before anyone understood what it was building toward. When it broke, it did so as a birth scream, a tsunami of emotion and psychic power that consumed hundreds of worlds at the heart of the Eldari Empire in a single event. Tore open a permanent, massive warp rift in real space that has been known as the Eye of Terror ever since, and emerged as the youngest of the four Chaos Gods. That was Slaanesh. At the moment of emergence, the Eldari pantheon was hit first and hardest. Asurion, the Phoenix King, eldest of the Eldari gods and chief of their pantheon. Morai Heg, keeper of fate. They were already weakened, their worshippers dying by the billions, their psychic food source collapsing in real time as the birth scream swept through their civilization. The wave hit and they were consumed, their power absorbed into the newborn god before they could coalesce a defense. 3 survived. Kegorak, the laughing god, fled into the webway before the wave hit, the only Eldari deity who still exists in original form today, the only one who knows every secret passage and has never emerged since. Cain shattered rather than being consumed outright, his fragmented essence scattered across real space, becoming the avatars of Cain dormant on Craftworld Wraithbone cores, expressions of war without his full divinity. Isha called out for help, and Nurgle heard her, entering into a war with Slaanesh to seize her, which he won. The Eldar souls Slaanesh consumed at the Fall weren't destroyed. They remain within the Dark Prince, still experiencing, still suffering. Every soul of every Eldari who ever lived, not just those alive at the moment of collapse, because before Slaanesh, Eldari souls reincarnated after death. Every soul that had ever existed was present in the warp and waiting when the birth scream hit. All of them were pulled into the Palace of Pleasure and held there. Not erased, perpetually experienced. Slaanesh is the only Chaos God with a proven track record of consuming an entire existing pantheon. The Eye of Terror is physical evidence, still present, still tearing at the fabric of the segmentum obscurus of what that consumption looks like at a galactic scale. One critical distinction the precedent reveals. The consumption of the Eldari gods was a psychic overflow event, not a military campaign. The Eldar gods were weakened because their worshippers were dying, and the overwhelming resonance of Slaanesh's birth scream consumed them in their vulnerable state. Slaanesh at the moment of birth was by some accounts the most powerful entity in the warp, but didn't then proceed to consume Khorne, Tzeentch, and Nurgle, who were sustained by the full weight of human and other species' emotional output and weren't comparably weakened. The precedent reveals the mechanism, though. Slaanesh absorbs experience. The Dark Prince's realm, the Palace of Pleasure, at the center of 6 concentric rings of domain. Each ring, a different seductive trap. Each path inward, a different form of sensation. Each deeper circle harder to resist and impossible to leave. Grows not through conquest, but through consumption. Those who enter voluntarily never wish to depart. Those consumed outright are held inside, their experience added to an ever-expanding palette of sensation. If Slaanesh absorbed the other 3 gods, their entire domains become new experiences to consume. Khorne's rage, previously an opposing force, becomes one more extreme of feeling. Nurgle's slow decay becomes another texture of sensation, a different kind of intimacy with existence. Tzeentch's ever-shifting ambition becomes one more form of desire to add to the collection. All of it feeds the palace of pleasure, which grows to fill the Immaterium, which then reaches into real space and begins the same process with mortal life. Every soul harvested is another experience added. Every civilization consumed is another set of sensations archived. And this is where the Slaanesh victory scenario reaches its logical endpoint. Sensation requires contrast. Pleasure requires the possibility of its absence. Desire requires the experience of being without. If Slaanesh consumes everything, every soul in the Immaterium, every mortal body in real space, every scrap of feeling available in the galaxy, there is nothing left to feel. The god of sensation, in consuming all sensation, produces perfect numbness. She who thirsts, having consumed everything, has nothing left to thirst for. The Eldari understand this better than any other species because they are already living inside it. Ennead, the nascent god of death, slowly accumulating from the souls of Eldari dead stored in Craftworld infinity circuits, is their only answer. The Eldar seers believe that once every last Eldari has died and their souls have combined, Ennead will have the power to confront Slaanesh directly. The mechanism isn't military superiority. Death is conceptually anathema to the god of excess. Ennead is the inevitable consequence of Slaanesh's own nature, the point at which all sensation must end. The Inari faction, led by the prophet Ivrain, has been working to accelerate this awakening. Some accounts say Slaanesh dies outright. Others say only weakening. Others still say Ennead would simply claim Eldari souls rather than destroy the Dark Prince entirely. The outcome remains genuinely unresolved. The structure of the problem isn't. The god whose victory requires consuming all experience eventually creates the condition in which no experience is possible. Slaanesh's ultimate desire carries within it the guarantee of its own dissolution. Every individual victory scenario carries the same structural failure. The winner inherits a depleted or self-consuming universe. The final scenario, all four gods destroying each other simultaneously, removes even the possibility of a winner. Canon's position on total mutual annihilation is stark. If the ruinous powers were to win such a dark victory against each other, it would likely destroy all of reality when the dimensional separation between real space and the Immaterium broke down in its wake. The warp isn't a passive container that sits quietly when emptied. It's the psychic mirror of the material universe, woven into the fabric of real space at a structural level. The gods aren't inhabitants who can be removed without consequence. They are, in a real sense, what the warp has become. That said, the warp as a dimension predates the fully formed chaos gods as coherent entities. Before they coalesced, it existed as an undifferentiated flow of emotional energy, the emotional output of sentient life running through a parallel dimension without taking on divine shape. The dimension itself isn't the gods. They are what the dimension became over millions of years of mortal civilization producing concentrated emotional energy. If all four were simultaneously eliminated, the practical consequences for real space would be immediate and civilization-altering. Warp navigation relies on navigators and psychers interfacing with a warp that currently has recognizable, if terrifying, currents and structures shaped by divine domains. Remove those domains and the navigational reference points collapse. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon the Emperor broadcasts from Terra to enable warp travel across the Imperium, functions within an environment partially structured by chaos activity. What it does in a fundamentally emptied warp is genuinely unknown. Every demon currently bound to real space, every demonic engine, every summoned entity fighting wars in the material universe, every chaos warband sustained by active divine power, loses its connection and dissolves. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the galaxy-spanning rift that Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade tore open, The wound currently splitting the galaxy in two and allowing demonic incursions at unprecedented scale, loses the divine power feeding it. The territorial wars between rival demonic legions currently being fought in real space cease, not because anyone won, because everyone dissolved. The Tau, with negligible warp presences and no meaningful psyker infrastructure, adapt relatively well. The Necrons, fully real space entities with no warp dependency, are essentially unaffected. They have been wading through far longer disruptions. The Tyranids, approaching from extragalactic space and navigating partly by the psychic noise of the warp, might accelerate their advance into a quieter corridor. The Imperium, built entirely on warp travel, powered by the psyker sacrifices feeding the Golden Throne, coherent across 100,000 worlds only because of the Astronomicon, faces an immediate and profound structural crisis with no clear resolution. The Chaos Gods have spent the entirety of recorded history fighting each other. They paused this conflict exactly once, not to seize an opportunity, not because one of their number was close to winning the great game. They paused it because something outside their internal conflict threatened to end the game entirely. The Emperor of Mankind's Webway project is the clearest statement in 40K canon of what the gods actually fear. The objective is recorded directly in lore. The ultimate goal of the Webway project was for the Emperor to completely sever humanity from the warp in its entirety, depriving chaos of its power. Not conquering the warp, not destroying the gods in battle, severing the connection. Redirecting humanity through a navigable extension of the Eldar Webway, a dimension separate from the warp entirely, requiring no psyker navigation, no Astronomicon, no interface with the Immaterium. Humanity would have moved through the galaxy invisibly from the gods' perspective. The single largest emotional food source available to them, simply removed from reach. The response was the Horus Heresy, the only known instance of all four Chaos Gods cooperating on a unified objective. Think about what this required. These are entities who embody betrayal, excess, decay, and violence respectively. They have no common language, no shared institutional structure, no diplomatic apparatus. They can't maintain cooperation by nature. The Great Game itself is the expression of their fundamental incompatibility. And yet, for decades, they held together long enough to corrupt half the Primarchs, fracture the greatest military force humanity had ever assembled, and bring the Emperor within a few hours of complete defeat. The preparation took years before the heresy became visible. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the Wordbearers and the first of the Primarchs to fall to chaos, spent that time in the Pilgrimage, a secret program of building the groundwork for what was coming, hiding his allegiance, constructing the ideological and logistical infrastructure the heresy would require. Erebus of the Wordbearers worked alongside him, tempering Lorgar's conviction and staging the early events that would set others in motion. The gods chose Horus Lupercal as their primary instrument, not because he was the most devout, but because he was the most capable. The War Master, the most gifted military commander of his generation, the one whose fall would take the most other Primarchs with it. The pact, as it has been recorded, was direct. Give us the Emperor, and we will give you the galaxy. They didn't want the galaxy. The galaxy was the price they were willing to pay. What they wanted was for the Webway project to fail, and for the man who conceived it to be neutralized before he could try again. It worked. Magnus the Red's psychic message to Terra, intended to warn the Emperor of Horus's corruption, sent in desperation against all prohibition, shattered the psychic wards protecting the Webway project's progress, allowing demons into the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The infrastructure the Emperor had spent decades constructing was destroyed in an instant. The Webway flooded with entities that couldn't be removed. The project was finished. At the Siege of Terra, the Emperor was crippled. He was interred on the Golden Throne and has sat there for more than 100 centuries, kept at the boundary between life and death by thousands of psyker sacrifices daily, broadcasting the Astronomicon that keeps the Imperium navigable. The Webway that would have replaced the Astronomicon was never completed. The moment Horus died on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, the Chaos Gods resumed the Great Game. The coalition dissolved instantly. No planning for the next stage, no post-war settlement. No shared program for what to do with a galaxy now drowning in the consequences of their collaboration. Just the immediate, complete return to the endless cycle of mutual destruction that they had maintained for eons before the heresy, and have maintained for eons since. This is the most important data point the Horus Heresy provides, not about the Emperor, not about Horus, but about the gods themselves. They are incapable of sustaining cooperation beyond immediate necessity. The moment their common enemy was neutralized, the cooperation ended. They can't plan a future together. They can't maintain an alliance that outlasts the immediate threat. They went back to tearing at each other because that is, fundamentally, what they are. And this reveals the truth the four individual victory scenarios obscure. The Great Game isn't primarily a competition between four gods vying for supremacy. It's the mechanism that ensures none of them become powerful enough to destabilize the system they all depend on. The gods fight each other to keep the game going, because the game going is the state in which all of them continue to exist. Winning means ending. Ending means starvation. The Great Game is its own preservation mechanism, not by design, but by the nature of the entities inside it. The one thing that has ever genuinely threatened this system wasn't a single chaos god getting too powerful. The check and balance mechanic handles that. What threatened it was the possibility of the food supply being cut off externally, not by battle, not by consuming each other, but by a single human being who understood, with precision that no enemy of chaos had ever matched, exactly what the gods needed, and exactly how to take it away. He was stopped, or rather, he was prevented from finishing. For more than 100 centuries, he sits on the golden throne, kept in a state that isn't quite life and isn't quite death, dreaming, if that word applies, whatever incomprehensible things a being of that psychic magnitude experiences in a stillness that has lasted 10,000 years. The cicatrix maledictum tears across the sky. The Great Game spills into real space at unprecedented scale since Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade cracked Cadia and opened the rift. Demonic legions of rival gods fight territorial wars in the material universe, each faction contesting ground not just from mortals, but from each other. Every generation born into this galaxy produces more emotional fuel, more despair for Nurgle, more rage for Khorne, more ambition for Tzeentch, more sensation-seeking for Slaanesh. The food supply grows, the gods grow stronger, the Great Game grows louder. No single god will win. The paradox of total victory guarantees it. The gods are imprisoned not by enemies, but by their own nature, by the fundamental reality that the thing they need most and the thing they would consume first are the same thing. The question the Horus Heresy reveals, the question the gods were willing to break their eternal war to prevent anyone from answering, was never which chaos god wins. The question is whether the broken, dreaming figure on that throne, after 10,000 years of near death, has found a different answer entirely. Subscribe for more stories like this.